For being a diverse woman and living in the chaos that I was living in at the time, we didn't have the craziness on the outside. However, the craziness was happening on the inside when nobody was looking. The fear of calling law enforcement, the fear of what our community members would say, being the only diverse family in the community. I knew what it was. However, I couldn't at that time seek the help that I needed for myself or for my children at that point in our lives. It's an everyday process. Not one day goes by that I sit there and I think about it and, oh my God, this happened to me 20 years ago, this happened to me. You just don't get over it. When I got pregnant and we started living together and his substance use was obvious, that's when the physical abuse started while I was pregnant. He will use our kids to threaten me. He would tell me things like, I can just take my kids to Mexico and you would not be able to do anything about it. You would not be able to find us. There was a specific incident that happened when I was at home and I was getting ready to take the kids to the park. And I went inside to take a shower. And when I came out, no one was at home. He was gone with my 3 kids. I got really scared because he had threatened me many times that he would take our kids without me knowing or noticing in the least expecting way. He came back home an hour later and just with a very sarcastic smile, he just said, see, I can just leave any time with our kids and you wouldn't be able to do anything about it. And that was a very specific threat that he could just do it at any time. And other times he would threaten me to take me to Tijuana, Mexico, and murder me, and no one would be able to do anything about it.
When you have an immigrant community, there are a couple very special sort of circumstances that can make those victims even more vulnerable. One is the lack of common language. Anybody that is working in an immigrant community could do very, very worse than making sure that they have solid language support for their work with that victim. Having a robust language support program is going to be critical to helping that survivor understand what services are offered and helping to deliver those services, and also, more importantly, hearing that victim's voice, which is critical if you're doing domestic violence work in an immigrant community. There are some other challenges that immigrant communities will face. If their legal status in the country is something that is questionable, that may be a barrier for, or rather another barrier for that intimate partner violence survivor to coming forward. And also, abusers will use immigration status as a way to control their victims further, keeping them from getting immigration status or making threats that they're going to report that person to ICE, report that person and take them away from the family, and then the kids will be there and we'll keep the kids in the country. And if you don't want that, if you want to be here with your children, then you need to do what I say.
There are many aspects of being an immigrant that can have an impact on someone's experience with domestic violence, but Their immigration status can often make them particularly vulnerable. We have clients who say that their spouses, if the spouse has legal residency or is a citizen, they may say that they're going to deport the client or take custody of that client's children, and that person then feels extremely vulnerable because they're then fearful of authorities, which is precisely where we want them to go.
I specifically remember an incident when I was at work, and at that little town where I used to work at there were only 2-hour parking, so I would have to move my car every 2 hours. And one time I came out to move my car, and he was inside my car looking everywhere, and I just was so scared. I was like, oh my gosh, how did you get inside my car? And what are you looking for? He's like, I know you're seeing other guys, and I'm sure you have something in here. And after like almost an hour of trying to convince him to leave me alone and leave, and that I was going to talk to him after work, he finally decided to leave. And I remember going back to work and I was shaking. I explained to the owner what happened, and he also became concerned, and he was actually, I wanted to talk to you about the situation because I've seen him coming around the restaurant really late at night and talking to your coworkers and asking them questions if they know if you're dating someone, if you're seeing someone, or what are you doing at work. And that's when I became really concerned.
There are many different kinds of stalkers. Most of us default to the jilted ex-lover. That's one type of stalker. There are people that stalk their ex-bosses, people that they believe slighted them, people that never reciprocated their affection. But when you have a jilted ex-lover, the goal many times is reestablishing a connection, but not necessarily a healthy connection. Sometimes I call this the human slot machine. So 10 phone calls and then the victim finally picks up the 11th. Well, that just tells the stalker it takes 11 tries to reach them. Now, why do victims answer the phone or the text or return an email? They're hoping that by being reasonable, they can stop the stalking. Not going to happen. Don't be a human slot machine. All you do is prolong the inevitable. The best way to stop an ex-flame from this relentless stalking is a firm no hesitation whatsoever, never retracting that no, and then if necessary, if the conduct continues and does begin to constitute stalking or harassing behavior or bullying, then it's time to get the authorities involved.
When we have victims of crime that are from other countries, the number one challenge is, of course, the language barrier. And we have to make best efforts to figure that part out and use whatever resources we can, language line, or if we can find a translator, et cetera. And we can't really provide them with the federal victims' rights or any services until we can get that language barrier figured out. But the other thing is the cultural situation and different cultures. We did have an incident of domestic violence in a campground in one of our parks, and it was witnessed and it was ongoing by the time the ranger arrived. However, the victim felt like it was her fault. It took a while to get translator to her, and she maintained that it was her fault, and that's what they do in their own country. And so that doesn't prohibit us from pursuing any charges or getting justice, but it makes things a lot difficult if you have a victim who no longer wants to be a witness in their own case.
When I was deployed in Iraq in 2008, I was part of the Lioness program, and I was attached to infantry units. I worked at entry checkpoints, so I saw all the individuals, the women and children, coming through the checkpoints to get seen at the hospitals. I met numerous individuals, especially one woman I will never forget. She was screaming, and I thought she was a suicide bomber, and I thought I was gonna have to shoot her. But I had a second instinct and found out that she was screaming because her husband had melted off her breasts. He had burned off her breasts for not having sex with him. I have been to other countries where a woman can be dragged down the street by her hair because it's her husband and she's his property, and everyone defends him. If you try and interrupt, you don't interrupt. It's his wife. He can do whatever he wants, and this is still going on.
I am actually an immigrant. I was born in a different country, and then my family immigrated here. I would say your family's history with law enforcement in your country of origin, that's a very significant barrier. So for my family, we're Russian, and so their history, we came over as refugees. So their history with law enforcement back in Russia was very contentious, and so they don't trust law enforcement. So you're dealing with the history with that family back in the country of origin, and you're also dealing with language barriers. You're dealing with victims that have their own norms and beliefs and gender roles, and all of those things that we take for granted here in America, that in other countries they operate very differently. Their laws are different, their norms are different.
If we have victims that are underrepresented within the criminal justice system, then we need to figure out how we can fix that situation. Do we need to conduct outreach into those communities? Do we need to show them that our law enforcement community cares about what happens to them? How do we fix any type of distrust to the system? How do we show these victims in these underrepresented communities that they will be treated fairly and appropriately and that their needs will be met?
From my personal experience and the culture I was raised, domestic violence is normalized, and I'm not the only one. So many other victims are and stay in these abusive relationships because they believe it's normal. And it takes a lot of courage to accept that it's not normal. A relationship can be so wonderful and amazing without abuse, including verbal and emotional abuse. Many victims have to accept that this is not normal, and that's part of education, bringing awareness to our community of what domestic abuse is, and to also bring awareness to our community and victims that, especially if they have children, that they're teaching their children to repeat this pattern in the future. And it's only in their power to break the cycle and to give their children the opportunity to live a life free of violence and to break the cycle of abuse in future generations.
When he was 21, I believe, when he met Linda Riccio, he was working at a car dealership, and she came to work there in the office. I think her position was in the parts office or something like that. And she was pretty aggressive about pursuing him. And, you know, at the time she was young and she was pretty, and he went out with her a couple of times. And the story that I've been told is that after they had gone out a couple of times, Linda showed up at his house one weekend day with her car full of her things. And she was crying, and she went to his door and she told him that her mother she'd had a fight with her mom, and her mom had thrown her out, and that she didn't have anywhere to go. After a few years, he met someone else, and it was someone that he liked, and he thought there might be a chance that they could have a real relationship. And so the next time Linda showed up, he told her, you know, it's been a couple of years now since we stopped seeing each other that way, and you've had time, and I've tried to help you, and, you know, it's time for you to let me get on with my life. And he told her, he made the mistake of telling her that he'd met someone else. And that day, she quit her job, she quit school, and she started to stalk him full time. And it consisted of things like her showing up in the parking lot of his apartment building in the middle of the night, and he was terrified. At one point, Ron came home to his apartment, and there was a note on the front door that was from her, and it said, "Look under the rocking chair." And he unlocked his door that was locked, his second-story apartment, and went inside, and she had taped a note to the bottom of the rocking chair. And she let him know repeatedly, in words and in writing, there's nowhere you can go, and there's nothing you can do that's going to keep me away from you.
Men are often very reluctant to admit that they're being stalked. They're unwilling, in many cases, to admit the degree of fear that the stalker has put them in, because that would be a sign of weakness. This is especially true, by the way, with same-sex stalking. There have been many occasions, and I've handled many of these cases, where men are very reluctant to admit the extent to which they're traumatized by being stalked, no matter who it is, whether it's an ex-girlfriend, an ex-boyfriend, or a stranger or an acquaintance, somebody that takes an unhealthy interest in them in the workplace, in the neighborhood, from a book club. There are just so many opportunities nowadays for stalkers to gain momentum by learning about their subjects that men often don't want to admit that they are afraid. When they do, they often have enhanced credibility in the eyes of the jury, in the eyes of investigators, because we know how hard it is to come forward when you're in that situation, that untenable situation that many men don't want to admit.
He came home from work in the dark, and he had a bag of groceries under his arm and his wallet and his checkbook in that hand, in his right hand, and he had his keys in his left hand. And he came up the stairs, turned his back to the privacy wall, bent over to put the keys in the door, and she stepped out from behind the wall and shot him in the back at close range. She used a .357 police revolver that shot 38s, and she used hollow points. And so the first bullet hit him in the back at close range. And before she had a chance to fire the second shot, he turned and he lobbed the bag, and it hit the gun. And the second shot went into the stucco railing at the front of the balcony. And then he was trapped. He hadn't gotten his door open. He had dropped his keys. He was shot, and he had no choice but to turn his back to her and run away down the stairs. And as he did that, she moved to the top of the stairs and pointed and fired at his back 3 more times. And she hit him a second time, and she had killed him.
Many times their significant other is aware of the unique position that police officers have with their job on duty and their family life off duty being completely connected. You cannot peel those two things apart. So their significant other knows that the abuser, they know that if this person, the victim, goes and reports me to law enforcement, I've got a trump card. I can call their employer, who happens to be a police department, and I can report just about anything I want and make up things. These men and women, the officers, the victims, they know that. So that's where the hesitancy comes from. They don't want to report it. They're afraid that they're going to end up in an internal affairs investigation. The officers that are in those situations know this. It's always top of mind. This is not in the back of their mind. And they know that at any moment, they could have their job taken away, or they can have some kind of negative employment action, despite the fact that they just don't want people at work to know. The average citizen, me, if I was a victim of domestic violence, I could go report it. Nobody here would have to know, most likely. If you're an officer, even if you're in a police department, you report it to the county, you work with all those people. They all work with you and your coworkers. Now everybody you work with is going to know that you are a victim of domestic violence. That shouldn't have a stigma attached but it does. We all know that. And right now, we can take steps to change it, but that's the reality. And so that stigma translates into the officers feeling like they can't report it because not only the backlash, but they can't report it because they're supposed to be superhuman. They're a police officer. They're just supposed to solve problems that the community asks them to solve. Their role is not to wear the hat of a victim. It's to be the mediator, the savior to the victim, the one that arrests the suspect. And it never occurs to them to wear that hat of a victim. So sometimes that denial, I think, causes it to be drastically underreported.
I recall an incident where a female police officer was reporting domestic violence to me. Her husband worked for the fire department in the same jurisdiction. In this situation, the survivor was minimizing the entire situation. A domestic violence restraining order had been issued, but the male suspect decided he was going to park 101 yards away from the residence in order to not violate the restraining order. But this also caused the victim to have to drive past his location when taking the children to school. What I had to do is I had to reframe that situation for her. I had to take her out of reporting it as a survivor, but as if she was going to be taking the report as a police officer herself. And once I went through every single step of the investigation and every single incident that she had reported and all the red flags that I saw from the outside looking in, I asked her, what would you tell a survivor in your situation from the outside looking in? And she looked at me and she said, I would tell them to run.
The more education we can do with really recognizing that Officer John Smith at work has this uniform on. Officer John Smith is that guy mowing the lawn next to you at home. He's your neighbor. And when you see him in his shorts and his flip-flops and his t-shirt on the weekend, you don't think to yourself, boy, if there's a domestic violence situation or a crime in progress, I'm calling my next door neighbor. Even though you know he's a cop, he just doesn't look like someone that's going to help. But when they wear that uniform, they are someone that's going to help. And I think we as a society view them in those two, we need to view them more in those two different lights, and that we don't all live next door to a police officer. So we need to recognize that they are human beings. They have all the same emotions. They have all the same struggles. They are men. They are women. They are gay. They are lesbian. Some are transgender. They run that gamut, and they're just like everyone else.
I was raised mostly by my grandmother. I was in a household with my mom until I was about 4. She never picked the right people to date. They were always verbal and physical abusive. I believe I was 5 the first time that I kind of got knocked over trying to protect my mom, as what kids do, from the man that I identified as my stepfather at the time. So it started young, very young for me. And for me, it was normal. It was probably 6 months after our daughter was born. I actually carried our daughter. When I really, really seen the disalignment take place, she played on a lot of the negativity from my childhood, the fact that my mom was an addict, growing up. There was a lot of emotional abuse in that respect until there wasn't. And what I mean by that is, at a point, it turned into physical. It turned into her not allowing me to leave the house, me missing work on her days off. And again, this person was in law enforcement. I was working for the court systems with the domestic women's shelters that I was working with. We were both professionals. On the outside, we looked really good. You would not know any difference. I didn't come to work with black eyes. I didn't come to work with busted lips. It was more at that point was mostly emotional I came to learn my name as being called a whore. That was my name, and it became no big deal to me. Our daughter was about 8 months old when I finally had enough. She had actually locked me in our room, and our older children, and at the time I believe our oldest daughter was 12, our adopted daughter, and it was during summertime, so everybody was home. I went to go out of the room, and I remember her putting her hand on the door and shutting it. And I remember her hitting the back of my head doing it. And when she did that, I kind of just sat there for a second with my head against the door, took a deep breath, and I turned around. And I remember being arm distance away from each other when I had my head on the door, but when I turned around, it felt like there was no space between us. She was in my face, yelling at me, calling me all her favorite terms. And I remember just almost like disappearing, feeling like that small child again, in that home, being afraid, being in that corner with my blanket and my go-to teddy bear. And it almost like I felt a shift in myself. It was enough. I was done. I could hear my girls, as they started to come back into, I could hear my oldest girl talking in the hallway, asking if I was okay. I remember thinking, my phone's in my bag. My phone is in my bag. I grabbed my phone and I opened it up, and I'm struggling to turn it on, and she's looking at me like, what the hell are you doing? And I don't feel at that point she realized what I was doing, but my phone was on and I started to record her. I was recording her yelling at me. I was recording her coming at me, and I was voicing everything that she was doing. She was throwing stuff at me. I would say, why are you throwing stuff at me? Do you really think that your sergeant would like to see this video? And at that moment, I seen her stop. I seen the whole world stop and shift. And I'm hearing my kids in the backyard playing. I'm hearing our youngest daughter crying because it was time for her to eat. And I said to her, what are you doing? Do you really want to do this? And she said to me, do you really think people are going to believe you over me? A piece of shit nothing that came from a whore of a parent, a drug addict that nobody wanted. You were nobody. And in that moment, I found my voice. And very respectfully, I said, yeah, I do think people are going to believe me. And this isn't okay. And this is going to stop right here. And with my little phone in my hand, I'm standing there and I'm recording her. And without fail, she took a step back. And then she left. As far as what society sees as domestic violence, history has shown that it's typically male and female. It's not. It's anybody. It can be anybody. It can be woman on woman, man on men. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have a prejudice to it. However, with that being said, there is a prejudice to it when reporting. Within the work that I've done, even on a personal level, I myself has been not necessarily judged, but dismissed because it is a woman-on-woman scenario. Even working just most recently in a situation with a client, a male client, that I was trying to seek advocacy through a local agency to get him in groups. They wouldn't have him in groups even though he was a diverse man with women because he was a man and he was presumed a perpetrator or the abuser. And it was detrimental to his journey. My client was beat to shit. You know, he took 24 stitches over his eye, and it was bro fighting I'm still trying to process that one, I think, bro fighting. That was kind of a new one on me. But society says it can't happen because there are two men. It can happen. Just like any other illness, domestic violence, alcoholism, it doesn't have a preference to who you are, what you are, who you identify as. It happens. Anybody can be a victim, then turn survivor.